Thank you for joining us today. First things first, we're just going to give our host an introduction. My name is Lexi, and I'm a second-year business student attending Bishop's University, and I've been with YCR for around a year.
My name is Sean Ryan. I am a regional ambassador for British Columbia and a University of Calgary student.
My name is Amelia Falk. I am entering my final year of chemical engineering at the University of Saskatchewan.
Amazing. Well, welcome back to YCR's Food for Thought series. For those of you who are just seeing YCR for the first time, we are an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals who believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at YC Resources if you want to learn more about what we do. Now, we'd love to introduce Tristan Goodman, the President and CEO of Explorers and Producers Association of Canada, or EPAC, a national lobby group representing Canada's oil and gas entrepreneurs with over 140 member companies producing a large portion of the national hydrocarbon endowment. Members spend billions of dollars annually across the country and directly employ more than 50,000 people in every province and territory. He is a leading advocate for the Canadian energy industry with government, regulators, the news, media, and general public. Previously, he was senior vice president with one nation's largest energy regulators and has worked for several multinational energy companies. He holds a Ph.D. in LL.M, LL.B, and other degrees related to natural resource management, law, environmental science, and economic history. Before I hand the floor over to Tristan, we're just going to do a quick little recap on the case competition, which is why some of you might be here to learn more about what that's going to look like. So quickly, I'm just going to go over that. I'm going to try to share my screen. All right. Can you guys see that all right?
Good to go.
Amazing. All right, so I just want to quickly go over YCR's corporate case competition. So our first competition of the year, we're very excited to announce the emissions cap case competition. And just some key things to highlight for you all is it's a $4,000 end prize at the end of it, which is really exciting. So you want to make sure you enter, you want to make sure you represent your company, and you don't need any business or case competition experience to succeed or participate in this case competition. So make sure you keep that in mind. There's a lot of benefits for yourself as a young professional doing this competition and gaining a lot of exposure and knowledge on this very important issue. So what is a case competition in its simplest form? A case competition participants strive to develop the best solution to a business or education related case study within an allocated time frame. So these are usually students act as consultants for a business and make a recommendation for a problem at hand. So YCR's case competition is a little bit different. Like I said earlier, you need no business, politics, or oil and gas experience necessary to participate. It's different from a business case competition as the focus is on a policy and the sector, not on just one specific company. And the recommendation will be directed towards Canadians and towards Canada. So consider the different perspectives from within Canada and how this could impact both domestically and internationally. And why is this good for a young person? YCR's case competition allows you to make an impression in front of executives and create an own brand to establish a strong network for yourself. So there's a lot of skills that come from case competitions that we think you can benefit from, improving your communication skills, better your presentation abilities, work well under pressure, become an effective presenter, overall sales capabilities, and many, many more. So all of this, there's more in these slides, but Tristan is here today to talk to you about the emissions cap and all those factors that impact it. All of these slides that I'm quickly brushing through now will be available tomorrow. We're going to send a mass email. If you are not on our corporate email list, please make sure you email me, lexi@ycresources.ca, to get involved and to reach out. I'm happy to send you any materials that you need. So please make sure you reach out to me. Here's your important dates. The completion date will be on June 28th and the presentations will be July 5th. And that's a $4,000 prize. So please, if you aren't already on our email list, reach out to me for more information. Now, Tristan, that's enough for me. So I'm going to pass it to you and I'm going to let you share your screen now. We're really excited to hear what you have to say.
Great. Presentation's coming up. So first, great to speak to you. My email is attached. If you want to follow up, don't hesitate. So again, I'm the CEO and president of a group called EPAC, Explorers and Producers Association of Canada. It's sort of a lot of oil and gas companies now doing a tremendous amount of also renewables on top of that. So most of them are sort of transitioning to energy sort of companies. What I thought we'd do is, instead of just starting right into the emissions cap, we'd sort of set some context here. And the reason for that is the emissions cap and the proposal for that is government policy. And basically, you sort of need to understand how government policy works, what's going on in the energy space, and then walking down into that. So it's a very pragmatic way to look at governments. The main thing here is, regardless if you're going into government, if you're going into business, if you're going into not-for-profits or ENGO sort of communities, environmental type groups, everything in a modern Canadian context is often pivoting around government work. They're very powerful, old, they have done good things, they have done bad things throughout, 10,000 years of history. So what I'm trying to sort of do is blend the two together and also remind everybody. I will say up front, by the way, I'm highly nonpartisan, and I actually mean that very openly. I work with all of these folks across governments, from NDP to Liberals to the Green Party to Conservatives. I'm not much into the political side. I am a policy type person. I'm very interested in making sure our country is doing well from an economic, social, Indigenous, and environmental standpoint. So that's what you're sort of going to hear from me. And I'm not going to give you every answer, but I am going to give you a lot of context. So with that in mind, I think my guess is, Alexi, you now control the screen. Is that right? Okay, we can move on to the next slide. And I'm going to go quick through some of these. So I hope your fingers are good. Perfect. Okay, so just a reminder, the reality is that we have a lot going on here. The slides themselves are not critical. Some of these are actually going back to 2014. You could get an updated slide. It doesn't matter. The key is you have to look at where traditional energy sources are occurring and who has what, and also what's being used. So the fact of the matter is, despite very good intentions and some success on reducing GHG emissions, there is an increase in development related to and use of both oil and natural gas. And Canada is very well positioned from a reserves perspective, in other words, the amount of oil or gas we have, to do well there. What we're really looking for generally, and this is actually what the current, all the current federal and provincial governments are actually partially trying to achieve, regardless of sort of who's sitting in power, is if we need to continue to use oil and gas, which we do for some period, probably a long period, let's try to make it the lowest emissions, the safest, and the best sort of culturally sensitive. It should contribute more broadly than just a development. Now, there also has to be an economic driver to this, which is important. Economics is driving a lot of this stuff. So that's really reflecting this, that Canada is well positioned on both these resources. And there are two main resources here we're talking about. It's not just about oil. Natural gas is a very strong transition fuel. Okay, let's move to the next one. So this here is effectively sort of reminding folks, what do we need to achieve here? This is tough, okay? I mean, the reality is it's generally accepted, everyone's moving forward, and particularly actually in the industry I represent, emissions are moving in the right direction. They're going down on an emissions intensity basis. The problem we're always trying to get to is sort of the hot dog stand problem. That's the hot dog stand. So this is actually a hot dog stand in Japan. If we use an analogy, Japan actually has the most Michelin rated restaurants in the world. I happen to like food, as you can probably tell. So I will admit, food is important. And for those who know me, they know I like nice food. It's very interesting to see a Japanese hot dog stand in Tokyo, which has the most Michelin restaurants anywhere on earth. And the issue really is, for example, ramen also started out like this. And ramen now, there are a number, it's actually quite a big trendy food. It's the same thing with energy. My point here is that we don't actually know which technologies are really going to work on a grand scale and which aren't, which are going to become the next Michelin food, which aren't. We know that renewables are entering the space. We know they certainly have a place in different locations and in different sort of utilization circumstances. But we also know that we sort of can't ignore the fact that traditional hydrocarbon development is going to continue in a major pace, and it is going to contribute in any foreseeable future, both oil and natural gas. And there's ways to really mitigate the consequences from a GHG perspective. Key is we haven't figured out yet what technologies work where and which ones are going to be successful. We know there's some that we certainly think are working well to date, such as CCUS, but this is an important factor. And again, it's about context. Let's keep going. So for this, external context first, we have a number of things going on. First, US oil production actually is starting to peak. The shale revolution is sort of coming to a bit of an end in the United States just because of geology. There's still some opportunities and plays there, getting more specific. But right now, you have a number of things happening. First, the picture up on the right-hand side is the Arctic, very sensitive area environmentally, important to know how to develop in there without doing damage from an environmental perspective. And it's generally be considered sort of off limits. It's interesting that the Biden administration has actually opened this up. And this is sort of a reflection of this push and pull of, okay, we desperately need to reduce GHG emissions, but at the same time, we have to continue to have energy to maintain the way of life that people have become accustomed to. Everybody on this phone, whether you like it or not, is using substantive amounts of hydrocarbons on a daily or even minute-to-minute basis. Most things that are around you have either been made out of it or have actually have energy put into it. So even the US administration is trying to manage how to do this. In the same vein, and the other sort of kitty corner to that is this Inflation Reduction Act. This is a key piece as it relates to any policy development. And effectively, I'll get into this a bit more, but the US has actually been quite successful in implementing policy, much more so than Canada, on reducing emissions and using the private sector to really move towards that. And it's effectively a gigantic carrot. And they have moved towards it. And it's really unfortunate actually for all sort of Canadian energy, because the problem is, it's not just an oil and gas problem, it's actually a renewable problem as well. Investment is leaving our country. We want money to stay here, to be invested here, and not just to flow into the US. Moving on. Okay, probably going, Lexi, thanks. So, bit of history. Let's just remember where we started, sort of recently in sort of a more modern perspective here. Obviously, there's been 10,000 years and multiple hundreds of generations from an Indigenous perspective. But when those two groups sort of met and started, we sort of look at this Quebec City establishment in 1608. And let's remember, the first thing that everybody did in 1608 in Quebec City is two main things. They started developing resources in this country, and they started working together with Indigenous communities. No one had a choice. And that has, in different ways, worked, and in different ways, let's be frank, failed. And that is where we are as a nation today. But we also have to be practical. This is a country that has huge advantage from a natural resource standpoint. Doesn't matter what you're talking about. Could be sun, could be wind, could be fish, could be forestry, oil, gas. The key is we have a history in this country for the last 400 years of working cooperatively to develop our resources. And we are now, in the last 15, 20 years, starting to run into problems. And I'm using that date, 15 to 20, because it's not a political issue. It's just a fact. You also have to look at how an economy works. So if you look at, for example, my sector, depending on how you work out the numbers, it's sort of 6 to 10% of the total GDP of the economy. But that's 6 to 10% that's an export-based piece. And if you're an economist in the room, you're going to understand balance of trade and the importance of balance of trade. You look at the top 5 things that Canada exports, 3 of them, as you can see, are related to oil and natural gas. Balance of trade is an important factor in the success of a country. It's not the only thing by any stretch. Economists will go into details on and debate, but it's something that's important. It helps. You wish to be able to provide exports, and you wish to make sure you control the number of imports. You have to obviously look at where you have a competitive advantage. But these are important factors when you do policy. Let's move on. So some internal context, quiet progress. And this is quiet progress across the entire sort of spectrum. So let's just go around some of the photos here. Let's maybe start at the top. That's the TMX pipeline, a major oil pipeline that the current Liberal government has moved forward on, purchased when it was in a bit of financial distress, and has ensured that it continues to develop as a national piece of infrastructure. And it looks like that is moving forward. It is very expensive to build. There's various questions around that, but the good news is it's being built. In the other side, the bottom there is a major, or Canada's first main LNG facility. This is LNG Canada, tremendous, another sort of major export point, something that diversifies our economy and flows funds across the country, as well as impacts jobs. And then you can sort of move across from there to see Chief of the Blueberry Nation and current Premier in British Columbia. They've reached a historic agreement on major Indigenous reconciliation components and make sure they're healing the land, they call it. In other words, making sure that people that are exercising their traditional rights on this in this area in British Columbia have a path forward. This is another positive step, both from an energy development standpoint, but also from an Indigenous reconciliation standpoint. And they do connect, by the way. These are important conversations. All of this still relates back to an emissions cap. And then finally, you have the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, and this is actually, a while back, he was announcing actually something related to some positive attributes related to oil and gas development. The point is there are nonpartisan pieces here. People can work together. People can find a way forward in this country. Obviously, recent election going on, we now have some understanding of what's going on in the province I'm currently sitting in, which is Alberta. I actually spend a lot of time elsewhere in the country, and that's obviously Rachel Notley and Premier Smith, or former Premier Notley and current Premier Smith. And then some work at the top that's going on. So my point is, you have to make sure we're separating what's being done versus what we think is being done from a political standpoint. It's important to make sure we just don't look at the media narrative. You look at actual facts. Despite your potential ideological positions, if you're far left, far right, sitting in the middle, it doesn't matter. Facts are facts. So we want to make sure we're focusing good policy development on facts. Okay, we can move on from this. So just another sort of component that's really talked about specific to traditional energy use, oil and gas, is, as a general rule, what we're seeing here is three sort of key parts. So first, in the conventional sector in oil and gas, which is things that really you drill instead of mine, you can think of it broadly like that. It's not exact, but it's close. Those emissions now are starting to come down. They're starting to come down quite dramatically. And that's for two main reasons. First, government policy is driving this behavior. And second, oil and gas companies are actually now very serious about this, and they're really putting in effort to lower emissions. And there are some lower hanging fruit, shall we say, on the conventional side. Pathways Alliance is the oil sands group, mostly miners, but also some others. They're doing outstanding work trying to figure out, they have a bit of a bigger, longer term problem. It's much harder to reduce emissions early, but their longer term opportunity is very large. And so they're thinking of many billions of dollars of investment. And it takes a long time to plan out events this big, but that has a great opportunity to reduce emissions. And then finally, one of the things we do have to acknowledge is renewable costs are coming down. So we, in the more traditional sense, we use actually now an increasing amount of renewables, increasing amount of renewable energy that helps decarbonize our sector. And renewable costs are falling dramatically, actually. There's still, you've got to still figure out where renewables work and where they don't. There's some still luxury components, options for very, very wealthy Canadians, maybe not so much for the vast majority of Canadians, but we're making progress here as well. So some good news that has to be considered. particularly in reference to an emissions cap. Okay, keep going. So this is an interesting slide because it's important to recognize who's out there. In the end, within all of these things, including government policy, investors actually are key. They're often hidden, they're almost an enigma, and it's all, quite frankly, a bit of magic. So I have the privilege of working with a lot of investors around the world, New York, London, all sorts of places in Europe, in other locations. And the fact is, there isn't one investor. You've got some sort of almost Mr. Burns type folks. And, you know, maybe they're only focused on one thing and I need to squeeze every value out of that. You've got some that are true enigmas, and Elon Musk, who's sort of no one can figure out exactly what's going on there. Everyone's going to have a different view of that individual. You've got Melody Hobson, who is actually the chair of Starbucks and just a tremendously positive force in not just the United States, but also more broadly, and a highly successful investor. One of the most, often ranked as one of the most influential women in the world. Tremendously positive force on all sorts of things, comes out of Chicago actually and went to Princeton. Very pleasant individual as well. So, and then obviously you have Warren Buffett. And then you've got some other ones. I mean, obviously you've got all the people in New York where most of the money sort of revolves around, and obviously groups like BlackRock, which most of you will know. My point is that don't ever forget, how will investors think of this? Policy is just policy until you think of how will people spend money. And I think this is one of the things that in Canada, we're sort of forgetting that the Americans are very good at. The US Inflation Reduction Act is an example of this. Okay, let's keep going. So now we'll move a little further down into where we're at. And again, we've got a lot going on. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's no question that Canada is going through a substantive decarbonization, and we have very serious governments. Obviously, the federal government is one, but you can look to any government. The Alberta government here, Premier Smith has made commitments towards net zero. Saskatchewan is already on track to decarbonizing. British Columbia has Clean BC as their policy. You look down at where the Ford government is, and it's really around trying to find that what's going to work, what isn't. One of the problems that we're having, though, is, and this sort of little cartoon seems to reflect some of this, is we do need to get on with this. I think we're having two sort of fundamental problems in any type of energy development. The first is, let's actually put these policies in place and start moving. The CCUS tax credit, it's still not in place. Carbon pricing contracts for difference, which is like an insurance or a protection on investing when your carbon price is around, still not in place. We need to sort of move on those key ones where there's some agreement or more broad agreement, and get on with that. And the other one is, we need to figure out why we're having so much trouble building things in this country. Large pieces of infrastructure are critical to be able to build, and they shouldn't be costing, for example, $30 billion, like a pipeline recently. That's too much in comparison to what that's worth. So we have some challenges, but we also have some policies that we can look to and sort of say, okay, there's some positives here we need to implement. Next slide. So going into the province, you've got similar stuff. You've got the Cedar LNG recently decision. You've got some competitiveness. David Yeager's leading some work in Alberta. If you're interested in that, I'd put his name in here simply because actually he's got some good ideas on how to make things more efficient. And then you've got a whole raft of other pieces going on. So again, both federally and provincially, in the context of this emissions cap, proposed emissions cap, you have a situation that really is broad. So I recognize you're going to focus on, for your case and your competition, just the emissions cap. You can't just ignore all the other factors. Good policy is about how do you integrate things. It's a little bit, for the economists in the room, like a regression analysis, or for a scientist, think of almost like double-blind random studies. You're looking for things that will integrate or things that will hold variables constant so you can implement what you're trying to do. Let's move to the next. So I just have a couple more slides. I want to talk specifically, I think I just have two or three more slides here about the US Inflation Reduction Act and what it really does. Because everyone thinks, well, it's about inflation. Well, it's nothing to do with inflation. It's just a name. Second, what it does do is create mass carrots for reducing emissions, both for implementing new technology, but also making lower GHG emissions from existing oil and gas or new oil and gas is being developed in the United States. There's a final one, though, that you have to take into account, and the US has always been very good at this. It's also about recognizing where things are going in a macro global perspective and making sure they position themselves there. And that's sort of what this little cartoon is saying. US always stands with its allies. Yes, they do, but they also squeeze them. And right now, everybody is being squeezed by this. And in some cases, we're being left behind. And there's reasons for that. A lot of it in the case of Canada, surprisingly, is not just fiscal. This is a big fiscal lever, but it's also about the clarity. Businesses, if you're doing a business degree, you will know the number one thing businesses need are certainty. They have to know and be able to look quickly at things to figure them out. If it's not certain, it creates risk. And when you are playing with other people's money or your own money, chances are you're going to be quite careful when there's risk. So one of the problems we have in Canada is it's like following breadcrumbs to try to figure out what's actually happening on climate policy. That's one of the main issues. So let's move on. So there's a couple more pieces that need to be relevant here that you need to consider. Indigenous is a major, in one sense, issue for development, but I think it's always looked at as a bit of a problem. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. It actually presents a phenomenal opportunity. I've had the privilege of working with many Indigenous nations across Canada, and the sort of generally the way items are looked at can be different, but it's a very positive, actually, opportunity way of looking at things. So what's happening right now is people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, are trying to figure out what to do here. Do we do courts? Do we do investing, which is, is a primary thing in Alberta and in the federal government of doing major investments? Or have we got a formula for how this may work, how partnerships or even joint businesses work together? And I think what we have right now is a lot of positive work in the front. And as it says in this little cartoon, then a miracle sort of happens, and then we get something positive out the back. That's not going to work. We're still sort of trying to all find our way here, but it is an opportunity that has to be resolved. So that's the key. Never forget, though, and never look at it as sort of, we see problems here. Yeah, there's some challenges, but there's also great opportunities. Very important within the context of any emissions policy, by the way. Okay, one more. Just to end, because many of you will be communications people or business has to communicate, or you're using economics or data science, engineering to do communications. So you're looking at facts. I think what we forget is there's different ways to do that. So for example, Lexi, you sort of started this by saying, we're an advocacy sort of driven piece. Okay, so let's just look at how you sort of do advocacy. Each one of these groups here is doing advocacy very differently, just as you are. But my point is there is a fundamental academic foundation to this, and you shouldn't really be looking at it as we're just going to go talk to people randomly and see what happens. That is not effective. So the data-driven behavior piece down at the bottom, that's Cambridge Analytica. Very analytical approach. If you like math, you're going to enjoy this approach. It's very effective for whatever you're interested in. Then you move over to a more sort of corporate approach, which is a blend of a bunch of things, which is the pathways group here, and sort of saying up front, let's clear the air, let's figure out how to do this together. Then you move into very academic work, classic works. And just like if you're in law, you will know what's called HOG, which is a very famous textbook in law, or if you're in medicine, you will understand Gray's Anatomy because that's your classic textbook, or if you're in other ones. So everyone's got their own. In communications and public advocacy, Zahler is sort of a standard text. My point is, with all of these, never forget to start with a good foundation. Why are you doing this? Have other people cracked the nut and developed a method before you run forward and try to solve problems. Solving problems is an easy part. Doing it sensibly in a grounding, that's why many of you are students going to school to learn grounding. When you go and start applying this, don't forget your grounding. And if you don't have it, go learn it. So next slide. So with all that in mind, a bit of context for the proposed emissions cap. And I had a lot of time, by the way, a lot of trouble finding a picture of Minister Guilbeault smiling. So, which I thought, I don't want to make this a partisan thing and have poor Minister Guilbeault there, who I know and is a charming individual, actually, sort of not sort of painting him in sort of this grumpy perspective. That's not the case. This is a few pictures here to go over and a few bits of context for your development as you move forward. So why don't we just start over on the far with the sort of veritas, which is truth in Latin at Harvard. So a few key groups. Harvard was definitely one of them. Yale was another. Toronto actually did a lot of work on this. They basically, over the last sort of 150 years, have developed something called the policy method. And there's different methods to this. But as a general rule, it's pretty simple stuff. And you can use this almost anywhere. And if you're not using this, you've probably got something wrong. So when you do your case, think about it this way. You always want to start with what outcomes are you trying to get to? What problem are you trying to solve? In other words, why do you want this solution? It's nice that you have a solution. What problem are you trying to solve? What's the analysis, the context, and the background? In other words, what have you already got done? And for this particular item or policy, that's actually the key variable. What are you trying to do with this? Because we've actually done the analysis. I understand why the federal government is looking at this, but I'm not sure it's necessary. Their policies are starting to work. And this seems to be much more a public narrative problem than another problem. And that moves to the next thing. The statue here well, I think we all know this is sort of the legal representation. This is actually the Old Bailey in England, which is a very old criminal court. It's the main criminal court in downtown. It's very famous if you're a legal fanatic like myself. The point is, you also have to look at what's legal. And one of the problems you have in Canada related to this issue is we do have a constitution. It's written down, unlike, say, Britain's constitution, which is not written down. It has a constitution, it's just not written. And within section 91 and 92 of that, there's a division of powers, which is effectively saying who gets to do what as government. So what does the province get to do? What does the feds get to do? And it's pretty much accepted law that the exclusive domain of the province is the development of natural resources. You don't get to impinge on that. So just because a fish swims by something and the federal government has interest in fish, that does not mean the federal government can step into that jurisdiction. The emissions cap has a bit of this problem because the emissions cap, given technology right now, may negatively impact production, which is the exclusive domain of provinces. And that's, you're going to have to debate that, but there is certainly a legal question here. And then there is the press. The other gentleman here is actually the chief editor of the Global Mail right now. And they are generally considered, for those that do communications, the national sort of paper of record right now. And given that, they have an influence. They often put out opinion pieces. And their opinion pieces lately have actually been reflecting in fair balance to say, no one's noticing, but actually emissions are coming down in the sector, oil and gas, which is this is sort of moving towards. And then there's other public groups and Indigenous Canadians. So you should ask, what role does Indigenous Canadians have? And then finally, you have the current minister of what's called EPAC, which is really Environment and Climate Change Canada. And he has a strong view on this subject. But he's only one of many different people within a cabinet. So politics is also at play here. And that's not to pick on him specifically. There have been some strong policies, good policies coming from the current federal government that has helped. And there has also been some ways that the federal government has helped decarbonize the oil and gas sector. There's also been some things where there's some head scratchers. For us in EPAC, and I'll conclude on that, this one's a bit of a head scratcher, to be honest. We're sort of wondering, we don't really think this is necessary. We think it does have all sorts of problems associated with it. But again, you may have a different perspective, and that's why we go through these things. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding, I think, and a good overview of a few different files on how you look at something. You never look at it as a single item. It is important as you get more sophisticated and start moving into a solid environment to look at more strategic factors than just the tactical. So thanks very much. Appreciate it. I'm certainly happy to take questions.
Yes, thank you, Tristan. That was awesome. Really appreciate everything you had to share.